taken me about 5 years to realise what it is that I actually do. So I start by saying I'm a reformed health and safety professional. But what I say to people now, that the short thing, is I help people turn learning into performance. And that's fundamentally, I think, informed by approaches like Safety 2 and Safety Differently. And that is very much the driver of me going to Dave and having that conversation about what safety clutter looks like, what decluttering looks like, and how we can actually make the world a better place, the world of work a better place, through this. And that was how safetyclutter.com was kind of born, through that mission. Because I realise I spend most of my time helping people bridge the gap between knowing and doing. You probably got a sense of that from me already. I get frustrated when we don't take opportunities to learn. I get frustrated when people talk about external attribution instead of taking ownership. And so I suppose that's going to be the tone of what I'll talk about today. We're going to talk a little bit about how you could declutter, but I think it's probably more insightful for us to give you some of the insights about our Safety Clutter scorecard and the macro level kind of insight we're getting out of that. So, as Dave said, so that's a collaboration between Safety on Tap and ForgeWorks. The important bit, which I think should be the next slide. Okay, so Safety Clutter, for those, who here has heard of the term Safety Clutter before? Just by, who here, hands down, who here is it the first time you're hearing about Safety Clutter? Okay, cool. So Safety Clutter is defined as the accumulation and persistence of safety work that does not contribute to operational safety. If I said to you before you'd heard about this concept, do you have Safety Clutter in your organisation? Most people say yes. It's kind of an intuitive concept. They've seen Marie Kondo. They kind of get the idea of what it is, right? We recognise it intuitively. But the important distinction here about the definition of Safety Clutter and what I'm going to talk about in our collaboration is that it's actually based in evidence. So going back to Drew's point about our evidence-based practice, a lot of people will go, yeah, no, I know clutter, or I'm decluttering or whatever, and I'm like, really? How are you going about that if you haven't heard about this? Because this is the only evidence-based approach to dealing with this problem of clutter. And that's not to say that, like, you know, there's only one way to do it, but it's to say that we should be doing our professional practice with rigour. So there are a couple of papers that inform this. The two most important ones are Safety Work versus the Safety of Work, and the clutter paper that Dave just mentioned. And if you want copies of that, because Dave is an author on both of those, if you ask Dave, he can give you a copy. Now, this is the critical link. OHS Professional as a critical consumer of research, and I'm extending that with Drew's provocation as a creator of research, as internal researchers. And hence we have this Safety Clutter scorecard. Has anyone done the Safety Clutter scorecard? Okay, cool. So for those of you who don't know, the Safety Clutter scorecard was effectively what Dave and I created in order to put out into the world the idea of the research. So this is a translation attempt in our mind about how do we take the journal concept, the theory, and help people put it into practice. And so that's effectively what it is. It's an online thing. You go to safetyclutter.com. It's free. You can do it. You get a tailored report out of that, which hopefully helps you close the gap between knowing and acting. The safety work model is really critical to this. So that was the other paper that I just mentioned. And the important distinction here is that we spend a lot of time doing things in the name of safety that have absolutely nothing to do with operational safety. A number of people have talked about that today. And so in that sense, how this ties in with Safety 2 is, if you think about this an analogy of the difference between work as imagined and work as done, we have that own challenge in our own professional work. We imagine that what we do actually impacts on safety, but you don't have to scratch much past the surface in order to work out that that's probably not always the case. So one of the insights that we've got out of our Safety Clutter scorecard, now that we've had, I think it's over 200 responses to it, so I'm giving you, I suppose, an insight into a data set of people like us and outside of this room. This is the really interesting thing about how we're thinking, because we can talk to you about how to go about decluttering, but knowing about that, having a process or the plan or the paper, we've found is actually not enough. And so probably the most interesting insight for Dave and I out of this is that we thought that there would actually be a flow of action that followed the knowing. That was kind of the hypothesis we had with this Safety Clutter scorecard. And it's been freaking crickets. So what I'm saying to you here is that this gap between knowing and doing is the space where change will happen. And I suppose that's the space that I'm interested in. So fears, barriers and objections I think are important to change. Kim mentioned Cotter before. Most of us are in the game of change. We think we're in safety, but most of us are in the game of change. So these are some interesting insights that we got. So the most frequently cited fear, barrier, objection to decluttering in your organisation is our need to demonstrate compliance to some other party. I'm just seeing some nods already. We also had this fear or barrier objection that they would cause someone, you would cause someone harm by removing something important. That seems to be a really valid concern. We also had this concern about losing data, information or knowledge. So these seem to be kind of reasonable things. I'm sure they're probably resonating with most of you. 41% of people said that that was actually an important fear, barrier, objection. 29% losing data, and, oh, I've got to go this way, don't I? And 19% causing harm. So what that means is that we are about 2.2 times more concerned with demonstrating compliance to someone else than we are about the risk of maybe hurting someone if we take something away. How does that make you feel? Because that's not what I go to work to do every day. This is our reality. So we are emotional. So I went through a conference presentation like this, and I kind of did a bit of a pulse check on the room. And what I did is a bit of a rough thematic analysis. It was like a post-it note thing. And I was just looking for the emotional words that people use to describe the fears, barriers, and objections. And these are the kind of words that people used. Lost, scary, helpless, protective, uncomfortable. This is our emotional reality about how we look at this problem. And so kind of one of my first hypotheses out of the Safety Clutter Scorecard is that I think we're really uncomfortable because we realise we've got far more fingerprints on this problem than we're probably happy to recognise. That's a hypothesis I would be interested to hear your thoughts on. We also know that clutter is actually dangerous, and these are some of the things that have come out of the research which talk about what happens when clutter exists in your organisation. So it steals ownership, it's distracting from real important things, including critical risk. It competes with production, because if you have a supervisor who spends their time doing their paperwork and not with their guys or gals, then that's actually a distraction. That's a production competition. It sucks resources, erodes trust. Again, I don't think any of these things are surprising for you. What I suppose I'm trying to do is to build a case of saying, you might feel like that, but this is the risk of doing nothing. So this is probably the most interesting insight out of the Safety Clutter Scorecard. It goes through and asks a number of questions, and one of the purposes of this data was to give you a personalised report back that helps you take action, but it's also for us to get insights into how we're thinking. I believe that in my organisation, a lot of time is spent doing things in the name of safety without actually improving safety. So if we were to do a Menti on this, you're going to get a curve like Michelle showed us yesterday. And this is what it looks like. So 70% of us, and I say us in the sense that the sample of people who have done the Safety Clutter Scorecard are mostly safety people. So in that sense, it's not a representative sample of people at work. So that's kind of a piece of work that extends what Dave and I are doing. But in any case, it's actually really quite representative of people like us in this room. 70% of us strongly agree on that. Now, there's two ways you can look at this. One is you could say that a lot of us are crap at what we do. Yeah? That we don't actually understand what's going on in terms of our effectiveness, or we could actually say we already know that there's a problem. And the reason why we have those emotional words when we talk about safety clutter is because we know that we are part of it. So is it benign or malignant? Again, these are a number of things in the paper that it talks about. Damaging employee ownership creates the problem of indifferentiation, what's important and what's not important. And so this really ties in with some of these concepts, the principles, if you like, of safety too, which is the difference between work as imagined and work as done. Workers kind of have trouble translating work as imagined, even when it's on paper, in a pre-starter or swims or whatnot, because they don't know what's important. Because when someone asks for step 7, like, how is that making sense to them in their work as done reality? It's bad for adaptability, and that is probably the most central problem with safety clutter, is that in the sense of control, and Andy used the kind of conceptual metaphor term yesterday, if our conceptual metaphor is around controlling work and having it standardised, which is almost impossible for most of us to do successfully, then what it does is it actually affects our ability to adapt. It actually squashes resilience. It erodes trust, as I mentioned before, and it creates trade-offs. And again, this understanding of the trade-off, the Eto principle that Erik has so generously given us, helps us make sense of when we do this, this happens. And I think it's incumbent on us to make sure that we think it will do this, we think a swims will do this, but if it does that, we own that. The regulators own that. And SafeWork SA were just saying yesterday that they're actually going to have a serious look at swims because it's time to do that. So the Safety Clutter Scorecard kind of looks at a number of safety work activities that we do. That again is based on that safety work model. A lot of these things would be familiar to you. They're not exclusive, right? This is just us trying to get a sense of, and what you can take away from it, is asking the question, are the things that we are doing actually contributing to operational safety? That's the definition of whether it's clutter or not. Interesting couple of insights. The number one concern from people like us, as in candidate for clutter, is safety performance reporting, right? So we've already kind of established, I think, that we are concerned about measurement and we are unsure about what to do. That's the strength. So that kind of fuel gauge thing is the strength of it. So it's not a particularly strong level of confidence about the level of clutter, and I'll talk about confidence in a second, but it's something that is consistent across all of us. We agree on this as an important priority. But that's really relevant to us. Frontline people don't care about that because they don't see that. So who's asking the questions about what is clutter becomes really important, and I'll tell you about that in a sec. So 75% of respondents. The next one is safety committee meetings. So most of us think that safety committee meetings are clutter. 69% of respondents. Personal risk assessments take 5, site hazard logs and site risk registers were the next 2. Now the data starts to go a bit funny there because what I've presented to you is 2 different statistics. How many people think this, and what's the strength of the belief? Yeah? How many people, what's the strength of the belief? And this is the beginning of how we start to understand what clutter is. So at this point in time, I say to people, do not declutter yet, because don't walk away from this presentation and say, Andrew said, I need to change my safety performance reporting, right? You are perverting what I'm saying. And so this goes back to what a number of the speakers have said, which is, Josh, I do it like this, you're going to have to do it like how you're going to do it, okay? So that's kind of the insight into going through a decluttering process, is that you have to ask these questions in your own context. So the important part about how to go about decluttering, the model has established the 3 C's of clutter. So how much safety value does this X, how does this thing actually add? The second thing is confidence. How do we know about that? Now, this is that strength question. How strongly do we know about this? And we talk here about evidence or belief. Now, there is very little evidence for most of what we do in safety. There's some evidence for like some really specific controls, like hard hats on construction sites prevent head injuries. There's good evidence for that when you have work above. Judy's shaking her head. When you have work above. So there's good evidence for that. But there's actually very little evidence for what else we do. So instead of us going, well, there's no evidence, and at this point in time we're getting really uncomfortable, we then turn to this idea about the strength of the belief, which is how we go to the source of expertise in our organisation, which is the people who are exposed to the risk. And so that's when we go to them and we say, if we don't have evidence from somewhere else, then we generate our own evidence. And that's very much the call to action that Drew gave us. And thirdly, the consensus. To what extent do the stakeholders involved agree? So you can only declutter if you go through this process. One of the most scary conversations that I've had once safety clutter came into my life is with an EGM of HSC in a really high-risk business, really big business. And this person said, I've told my systems manager we've got a 75% reduction target for our number of systems documents or whatever. And I went, shit. So what does that make you think about that process? So this guy thought he was going to go through a decluttering process. And that raises questions for us. Dave was there at the table at the time. That raises questions for us like, well, which 75% are you going to get rid of? What if 75% of your system and 25% is good and 25% is bad, and you get rid of 75% of good, which means you have no good left, right? So this is the point about kind of taking a blunt approach to safety decluttering. So going about safety decluttering or dealing with safety clutter should be an evidence-driven approach, but that doesn't have to be a boffin academic evidence-driven approach. You can do that as an action researcher, as an inside researcher. And models like this help you do that. It's actually not that complicated. So consensus is really important. Sources of clutter are really important to consider as well. I'm not going to go too much into this because it is in the paper, but in order to deal with a problem, we kind of have to understand where it comes from as well. So generalisation is probably the one that we've already heard about today. 5 types of inductions. I think Deirdre, where's Deirdre? Oh, sorry, hey. Deirdre talked about that yesterday. So that's an example of clutter, clutter by duplication. That's an example of clutter by duplication. Generalisation is the idea of going, well, if you do a take 5 in the field, then we should probably do a take 5 in the office. things like that. And clutter by over-specification, which is what we'll do is we'll have an action or a control which says if something goes wrong, we'll just add in more administrative controls usually, and we over-specify things. And what that, again, means is that we reduce adaptability because we're trying to control the things that we shouldn't be controlling, right? Because that's where adaptability lives, that's where resilience lives. The ratchet effect I'm not going to talk about. I think there are some deeper challenges. So I've kind of touched on this idea about reading the headline or cherry picking ideas. So if you go away and start decluttering because you've heard this presentation, then I'm sorry to say you've missed the point. And I think that this is part of the challenge, in particular with safety too, which is like, if we're trying to convey these messages, Kim said, read, read, read. We kind of take the headline and we take a little bit and piece here and we don't actually understand it, which means that potentially we're going to pervert it in the process. There's also shades of grey here. Actually, I won't talk about that. Well, I'm losing time. Yes equals no. So one of the most important insights, which hopefully Dave will link in with the role of the safety professional later, is this idea that everything that you say yes to means that you say no to something else. And so I, again, think one of my hypotheses is one of the biggest barriers to health and safety professionals tackling clutter is that we have to deal with the clutter in our own work and our own job description. Yeah? So that when the board says, yes, we should go and do drug and alcohol testing in our office or whatever, it's something stupid. If you think it's stupid, say no. Look at your calendar and say, what can I take out of this that I think is clutter that's within your own control? So we try and say, well, safety too in practice, that's really important, but you have to take stuff away out of your limited resource space before you can add stuff in. But you can do that with your own calendar. You can do that with your own team. You don't have to change the world in order to do that. And sunk costs is the other thing I want you to have a think about, is this idea that we have fingerprints on this stuff. I've got fingerprints on this stuff. I have committed many sins in the name of safety clutter. But I'm owning that. So there's a couple of things here in terms of the taking next steps. Probably the most important thing is you've got to start to have a conversation and socialise the idea of clutter. Low-hanging fruit, there's always low-hanging fruit, and you have to base it on the 3 Cs model. Conducting a controlled safety clutter removal trial is kind of what Drew alluded to, and yesterday we heard about that in terms of Downer and what they're doing as well. And Drew, Dave's going to talk about redefining our role because we have to rethink what we do in order to think about this problem too. Right, thank you.